It was January 12th, 1869, in Lafayette, Louisiana. The winter air was cold, but the town square was charged with the uneasy energy of a world turned upside down. The Civil War had ended 4 years prior, but for men like Colonel Silas Thorne, the battle never truly ceased. Malachias Walker, a freedman, played his violin, lost in a melody that was pure, crystalline, and achingly beautiful, a sound that should not exist in such a harsh world. The violin itself was old, ancient even, its wood scarred and worn, but in Malachias's hands, it sang. The crowd was a mixture of wonder and discomfort. Freed men, poor, resentful whites, and the ruined former aristocrats like Thorne, clinging to the wreckage of their pride. Colonel Silas Thorne, 53, was a man hollowed out by bit. His fortune had evaporated. His plantation, Thornwood, was falling into disrepair, and he was consumed by anger. But what truly gnawed at him was the sound of that damned violin in the hands of that boy. The music stopped abruptly. Thorne stood before Malachias, reeking of whiskey, the promise of violence his constant shadow. "That's a mighty fine instrument you got there, boy," Thorne said, his voice deceptively soft. "Where'd a underscore let you get something like that?" Malachias, holding the instrument close, replied steadily, "It was given to me, sir, by someone who wanted me to have it." Thorne's gaze was fixed on the violin with an intensity that bordered on recognition, and his hands began to tremble. Malachias explained his benefactor was a gentleman who believed music belonged to those who could play it. Thorne spat the word gentleman like a curse and demanded to see the instrument. When Malachias refused, Thorne's hand shot out, gripping the neck. For a moment, they were locked in a grotesque tug-of-war, the instrument suspended between them. "Let go, boy," Thorne hissed, his voice desperate, going beyond simple cruelty. "Please, sir, it's all I have," Malachias whispered. Thorne made his decision. With a violent wrench, he tore the violin free, raised it high, and brought it down against the stone pavement of the square. The sound of splintering wood cracked through the air like a gunshot, the strings snapping with musical screams. He smashed it again and again until the beautiful instrument was reduced to scattered, broken pieces. The silence that followed was absolute. Malachias stood frozen, his hands still raised in the position they had held. Thorne surveyed the shocked crowd, his chest heaving. "Let that be a lesson," Thorne proclaimed across the silent square. "To all of you, there are some things that don't belong in the hands of your kind. Some things that will never be yours, no matter what pieces of paper the government in Washington sends down here." As Colonel Thorne finished his arrogant pronouncement, something unexpected happened. His eyes fell on the wreckage, and his face drained of color, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. He stepped back, as if the broken wood had become dangerous. Unaware of Thorne's reaction, Malachias knelt tenderly among the debris, gathering the pieces as if they were the bones of a friend, ignoring Reverend Johnson's pleas to leave the broken instrument. Malachias worked methodically. As his fingers traced the shattered edges of his most precious possession, he felt something strange. A larger piece, part of the violin's back, felt too light, too hollow. His fingers found a seam an old, deliberate crack that had widened just enough to reveal a long-kept secret. The destruction had changed everything. Malachias realized his violin had been hiding something. He quickly left the square, cradling the largest fragments. Possessed by an electric intensity that was neither grief nor anger, but sudden understanding. The crowd assumed he was retreating to grieve. Half a block away, Colonel Thorne stopped, listened, and turned back. His eyes found Malachias's retreating figure, and he whispered, "No, he couldn't have. He wouldn't have." Fumbling for his silver pocket watch, Thorne made a decision. He turned and hurried toward the law offices of Bertram Coates on Main Street, walking away from his own home. Malachias raced home, his mind consumed by the history of the violin that had been given to him 3 years earlier, in 1866, by Tobias Thorne, Colonel Silas Thorne's father and the former patriarch of Thornwood, on his deathbed, consumed by fever. Tobias had called for Malachias, and only Tobias had handed him the violin with strange urgency and made Malachias promise with his dying breath never to let anyone take it from him. Tobias, the man who had risked community standing and angered his son by teaching a slave child to play, had whispered, "Keep it safe. Keep it close. No matter what happens, promise me." Malachias burst into the cabin. His mother, Sarah Walker, a woman hardened by survival, immediately saw the splintered wood and her breath hitched. Colonel Thorne, that evil, bitter devil, had done this. He's been looking for a reason ever since his daddy died. Ever since Sarah abruptly cut herself off. Malachias looked up sharply. Ever since what, Mama? Nothing, she quickly lied. I just meant ever since the Colonel took over the plantation. Sarah Walker, as evasive silence and unconscious gesture toward a small scar on her throat, told Malachias everything he needed to know. His mother was hiding a profound secret. Ignoring her pleas, Malachias carefully worked at the old seam in the broken violin panel. With a soft cracking sound, a section of the back panel separated, revealing a hollow cavity. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a folded document sealed with ancient red wax. The seal bore the crest of Thornwood Plantation, the Thorne family seal. Malachias's heart pounded. He looked up at his mother, who was staring at the papers with an expression that blended shock, fear, and recognition. "Mama," he asked slowly, "did you know this was here?" Sarah's silence was confirmation. Who was my father? The question never asked before exploded into the small cabin, startling his sister, Naomi. Sarah Walker collapsed into a chair, a head besudden. Terrible truth. His name was Tobias Thorne. The revelation the old master, the kind man who taught him violin, was his father sent Malachias his world tilting. Colonel Silas Thorne was his half-brother. The colonel's personal, desperate rage now made a terrible kind of sense. With trembling hands, Malachias broke the seal. The document was a will written in Tobias Thorne's own hand, dated 1860. It was not the public will, but a secret testament intended to survive until the end of the war. The words were impossible. Tobias Thorne openly acknowledged Malachias as his son and bequeathed to him the entirety of Thornwood Plantation, including the house, the land, and all properties and assets associated with it. But there was more. Attached was an older document, a certificate of manumission dated 1858, which freed Sarah Walker and all her children, born or yet to be born. Malachias realized he had been legally free his entire life, but the documents had been hidden. In a flash of terrible insight, Malachias understood why Tobias had hidden them in the antebellum South. Revealing that truth would have meant murder for Sarah and himself. Tobias waited for the safety of emancipation, but died too soon. He hid the legal proof in the one object he knew would stay with his son, the violin. The implications were staggering. Silas Thorne had been living in a house that legally belonged to Malachias for the last 9 years. But would any court in Reconstruction, Louisiana, honor a black man's claim over a white man's entire estate? Malachias stood abruptly. He now understood with absolute certainty why the colonel had smashed the violin. He had suspected it contained this proof. Malachias realized the terrible truth. Colonel Silas Thorne had suspected his father had hidden something that would threaten his claim to Thornwood. His terror and rush to the law offices confirmed his fear. A man this desperate was capable of anything. Malachias was determined to seek justice when his mother, Sarah, screamed that he would be killed, pointing out that no court would honor a black boy's claim to the parish's largest plantation. Malachias knew she was right, but the righteous fury born of his father's fine attempt at restitution and dignity would not be contained. "I have to," he told her, gently removing her hand. "You understand that, don't you?" Sarah saw the man he had become, a man with a determined glint of Tobias Thorne, and knew arguing was useless. "Then I'm coming with you," she declared. A silent show of unbreakable solidarity. They headed toward the federal marshal's office on Bourbon Street. Marshal James Garrett, a Reconstruction official from Massachusetts, was one of the few white men the freed population trusted, but even he had to navigate the volatile politics of Lafayette. As they approached the office, Malachias's steps faltered. Tied outside was a magnificent black stallion bearing the Thornwood brand. Colonel Silas Thorne was already inside. The office door opened, and Thorne emerged with Marshal Garrett. Thorne saw Malachias and his mother, and his face cycled through shock, fear, and settling into cold rage, his eyes fixed on the folded documents tucked against Malachias's chest. "Well," Thorne said softly, his voice dripping with menace. "Look who's here." Ignoring Thorne's sneer, Malachias forced himself forward. "Marshal Garrett, I need to report a crime. Colonel Thorne destroyed my property this afternoon." Thorne dismissed the violin as a mere fiddle. Malachias countered. "It was given to me by your father on his deathbed." He then directly challenged the colonel. His mind was perfectly sound. Sound enough to hide something that he wanted me to have, something that you've been looking for. Garrett, hand moving instinctively to his pistol, watched the tension explode. Malachias reached into his coat and produced the documents, holding them up to display the broken seal and the Thorne family crest. These were hidden inside the violin. "Legal documents, sir. A will and a certificate of manumission," Thorne immediately shouted. "Those are forgeries." "The boy made them himself." "I can verify my father's handwriting," Marshal Malachias countered, his heart pounding. "Compare the handwriting with records in this office," Thorne snapped. "You expect us to believe that my father would leave Thornwood to you? It's ridiculous." "Impossible." Malachias met the colonel's furious gaze, seeing their shared bone structure, their identical features. Is it impossible for a man to acknowledge his own blood? The question hung in the air like a blade. Sarah gasped. Marshal Garrett, his eyes dotted between the two men as understanding dawned. "Lies, Marshal," Thorne hissed. "Arrest this boy." "For what exactly?" Garrett asked, quiet but firm. "For having documents that may or may not be authentic." Malachias handed over the precious papers, watching as the marshal carefully unfolded Tobias Thorne's secret will and began to read. Marshal Garrett looked up from the will, his expression serious. "These are serious allegations. Authentication will take time. Weeks, maybe months." Colonel Thorne, having regained his composure, interjected, arguing that Malachias would use that time to concoct lies. Malachias challenged Thorne's own claimed inheritance, pointing out the suspicious, unwitnessed timing of Thorne's probated will. Garrett stepped between them, acknowledging the colonel's will was unusually unrecorded for a man of Tobias's standing. However, he warned Malachias, "What you're claiming would overturn settled law. Half the men in this town would rather see you hang than see you inherit Thornwood." Malachias felt his mother's fear, but stood firm. "Marcia, with respect, I've been in danger my whole life. The only thing that has changed is now I have a chance to be in danger for something that matters, for something that's mine." Garrett agreed to take the documents into federal custody for authentication, ordering both men to stand down. No retaliation from Thorne. No attempt to seize Thornwood from Malachias. As Garrett turned back to his office, Colonel Thorne leaned in, his voice dangerously low. "You've made the biggest mistake of your life, boy. My father was a fool and a race traitor, but I'm not. You'll never see a penny of Thornwood, and if you persist in this insanity, you'll find that accidents happen all the time in Louisiana, particularly to Wapiti _ who don't know their place." Thorne rode away without a backward glance. Sarah, trembling, whispered, "He's going to kill you. You know that, don't you?" Malachias reassured her, noting that the marshal's knowledge now made any attack look suspicious, but he didn't know if that would truly deter the colonel. They returned home, their small cabin now, a place of intense anxiety. Hours later, near midnight, a knock came. It was Marshal Garrett, his face grave. "I need you to come with me now," Garrett said. "There's been an incident at Thornwood. Colonel Thorne is dead." Malachias's world spun. Dead. How? It had only been hours since the threat. Garrett led Malachias to Thornwood. Through the front door threshold, Malachias had never legally crossed and into the library. Behind his massive mahogany desk, slumped in his chair, was Colonel Silas Thorne, dead from a gunshot wound to the temple. But the wound was not the most shocking detail. Clutched in the colonel's right hand was a pistol, and on the desk lay a letter, weighted down with a paperweight. Suicide, Marshal Garrett stated quietly. Or that's what it's meant to look like. Garrett handed Malachias the note. It was a confession, signed by Silas Thorne, admitting to falsifying his father's will, bribing witnesses, his shame over his father's relationship with Sarah, and his hatred for Malachias. The letter concluded that upon seeing the broken violin, he knew his deception was over. I cannot live with the shame. I have been neither honest nor weak. May God forgive me. The confession was too convenient, too perfect. It was exactly what Malachias needed to claim Thornwood without a long, bloody, legal battle. Marshal Malachias said slowly, "This doesn't feel right." Garrett agreed. The question was whether this was genuine suicide or a murder staged to look convenient for Malachias. 2 days later, Garrett returned to the cabin. He had found small boot prints at Thornwood and confronted the owner. Dr. Harrison, the physician who had supposedly witnessed Tobias Thorne's fake will. Harrison confessed. Fearing ruin if the truth emerged, he went to beg Thorne to suppress the documents. Instead, he found the colonel ranting, consumed by humiliation. Harrison seized Thorne's pistol, forced him to write the confession, and then pulled the trigger. In his twisted logic, he believed he was helping Malachias gain an uncontested claim. The legal process moved quickly. Harrison was convicted of murder. The documents, authenticated in Baton Rouge, were declared valid. On March 3, 1869, less than 2 months after the destruction of his instrument, Malachias Walker took possession of Thornwood Plantation. Standing on the front steps, looking over the fields where he had been enslaved, Malachias felt no triumph, only a profound sadness for the human cost of this inheritance. He kept the broken pieces of the violin, displaying them in a glass case in the library where Silas had died. It was beyond repair, but Malachias wanted the fragments to remind everyone that sometimes destruction is necessary for truth to emerge. Sometimes things must be broken before they can be made whole. Malachias transformed Thornwood. He hired teachers, opened a school for freed children, and divided the land, giving parcels to the families who had once worked it in bondage. He learned piano and filled the house with music. He often wondered, if Thorne hadn't destroyed the violin, would the truth ever have emerged? Malachias never knew the answer, but he understood this. 2 hours had changed everything. Years later, as an old man, Malachias explained the broken violin to a visitor. That violin carried me across an impossible distance, but it could only do that by being destroyed. Sometimes the most beautiful music isn't the sound an instrument makes, but the silence it leaves behind, and what that silence allows us to hear. His father, Tobias, had given him 2 gifts, music and justice, and Colonel Thorne, in his hatred, had inadvertently become the instrument of that justice. By destroying the violin, he had released the truth it contained. By trying to erase Malachias's last possession, he had given him everything. It was the strangest kind of poetry, the kind that could only be written in a world where right and wrong tangled together like the strings of a violin. Malachias died peacefully in 1909. Thornwood remained in his family, and the school grew into a college. The broken violin remained in its glass case, a testament to the idea that sometimes destruction is the doorway to justice, and that the distance between despair and hope is measured not in miles or years, but in hours. Just 2 hours that changed everything. The story of Malachias Walker and his violin is a brutal poem about the architecture of justice. It was not law or conscience that brought down the colonel, but a paranoid act of violence that freed a hidden truth. What lessons do you take from a victory won not by fighting, but by survival and the strange, sacrificial purpose of an inanimate object? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this tale of Reconstruction-era justice compelling, subscribe to the Forgotten Liturgy. Hit that notification bell and share this video with someone who understands that sometimes the most profound changes arrive, not gradually, but violently, in the space of just 2 hours.